Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of ATTMind Radio. I am your host, James W. Jesso, and I am hanging out in the gritty, gray, muddy Ontario, Canada, late winter. It's not quite cold. It's not quite warm. It's not quite winter. It's not quite spring. It's kind of just gray, but at least it's not snow and gray and trapped inside, which would be a lot worse. Other than my most recent talk, which is called Psycho-Spiritual Maturity and the Psilocybin Experience, which was recorded live at Cosmos Festival in Finland, being released onto Bandcamp, as well as being released now onto YouTube, which you will probably see it in the related videos here if you're watching this on YouTube. Other than that being released, there isn't really a lot of extra new stuff that I have to offer you insofar as what I've been doing. I've been settling back into writing now, and I'm working on a couple pieces that will hopefully be out in the coming months, but thankfully I'm not in a situation where I need to push it, so I have a lot of time to really settle into the artistic process insofar as writing those pieces, as they do talk about the intimate experience of coming to know your own mortality, and so it's good to take time to represent what that's like appropriately. But what I do have, somewhat excitingly, is that I didn't realize this from before, but for iTunes reviews, it's not just one country. You have to check each different country independently to find out whether or not you've been getting reviews. So for all I knew, I only had 2 reviews from way long ago when I first started the podcast in Canada. But it turns out I actually have several reviews, but they're just mostly from other countries. I did pick up a couple 5-star reviews on iTunes. In Australia, Japman said, more geese. Japman says, lots of insightful interviews on topics that are outside the usual discourse of altered states of consciousness and psychology, pushing the boundaries with clarity. Thanks, Japman. And Nelly Sue says, the presenter James W. Jesso asks extremely thoughtful questions and gives his guest speakers plenty of space to share their knowledge freely. This podcast is such a joy to listen to. So thank you to both of you two from Australia for those reviews, one of which was last month, one of which was 6 months ago. I'm really sorry about that. This whole podcasting process is a learning journey. I'm doing my absolute best to study, to dial in, and to get this to be as epic and amazing for y'all as possible, but I'm also sort of hacking my way through a jungle haphazardly, trying to make sense of it along the way, having your support in the process and having the support of standing on the shoulders of giants of other podcasters who have inspired me to even start this show, let alone grow it in a positive way. And so speaking of growing it in a positive way and leaving reviews, if you are enjoying ATTMind Radio, one of the best things that you can do is to head over to iTunes or Stitcher and leave a positive rating or review for the podcast. It helps the algorithms help people find us, and the value of the podcast grows exponentially the more people are listening to it. Of course, there are other options there too, so jameswjesso.com/support to find out how you could be a direct contributor to the growth of this show. All right, onwards and into the interview with Mark Wolyyn. He is the author of this book here, It Didn't Start With You, which is a fantastic read on the topic of intergenerational trauma inheritance, including family constellations as well as epigenetics, and what he talks about as the 4 unconscious themes that seem to be behind all pathologies that people embody. One unfortunate complication is that this interview was not shot in video and it's only in audio. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you will get to see a beautiful picture of Mark, his headshot, along with a picture of his book and a picture of myself. So you're not going to be without visual eye candy, but there is no video. But the audio quality is very clean. So if you're listening to this on one of your podcatchers, say iTunes or Stitcher or whatever, I use Podcast Addict personally, you won't even notice. So just pretend I didn't say anything. But that's it for the intro. Please enjoy this episode with Mark Wolyyn here on ATTMind Radio. Mark Wolyyn is a leading expert on inherited family trauma. As the director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco, he trains clinicians and treats people struggling with depression, anxiety, panic disorder, obsessive thoughts, self-injury, chronic pain, and persistent symptoms and conditions. A sought-after lecturer, he leads workshops at hospitals, clinics, conferences, and teaching centers around the world. He has taught at the University of Pittsburgh, the Western Psychiatric Institute, I think I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Kripalu, the Omega Institute, New York Open Center, and the California Institute of Integral Studies. His articles have appeared in Psychology Today, Mind Body Green, MariaShriver.com, Elephant Journal, and the Psych Central. And his poetry has been published in the New Yorker. His book is called It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you for having me, James.
So I've been really enjoying your book, or I have really enjoyed your book, and it's opened up, when you're reading a good book, there's this sense of a whole new world being opened up to you. And I know in fictional novels, it's like a whole new world that just dives into this book. And when in nonfiction, especially nonfiction that relates so deeply to the workings of oneself, it's almost like it opens up a whole new world of perceiving yourself and the world. And your book has been really complementary to my own process of just doing my best to awaken more and more to who I am and the nature and the quality of my relationships and how to best optimize that to live a good life on the whole, which sometimes means feeling the uncomfortable feelings. And so before we get in, I just wanted to express thank you for the book, because it's been very influential for me.
I'm so pleased. I'd love to hear that.
So we live in a society overwhelmed with mental illness, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, chronic pain, and addiction. And I'm of the understanding that the root of these conditions is maladaptive behaviors and perceptions forged by trauma, by unresolved emotional events from the past. And that the most significant traumas we carry, as we all carry trauma to some degree, comes from our childhood. That the parental ecology we were immersed in lays the foundations of our identity, behaviors, and our autonomic emotional interpretation of the world. Your book, It Didn't Start With You, explores how our identity is wired into us as children and goes further than discussing our childhood, because it's kind of common to think about the therapist's couch and lying down like, tell me about your mother. But it goes beyond this and invites us to consider the role that significant events in our parents' and grandparents' lives have influenced us, even events that went on long before we were born. You discuss neurological development, epigenetics, language and memory formation, attachment and parenting behaviors, and the general psychology of trauma across generations. And furthermore, your book is it's actually like a workbook. There are exercises inside, and it's really a book that's, of course, about empowering you with knowledge, but it's also about empowering you with technique and resolution and the kind of knowledge that teaches a person to fish rather than explain to them simply what a fish is. And what really sets this book apart, like I said before, is this wide angle from which you look at trauma, taking it back generations and outwards through an entire family system. So I want to start by narrowing in on that. You write early on in the book, quote, "What sits unresolved in our past influences our present," end quote. Can you please explain this in the context of trauma and say various forms of mental illness, and then how that might be carried down through generations?
So when we have a trauma, it changes us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA, and this changes how our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, after a traumatic event, a chemical tag can attach to our DNA. It's a signal in a sense, and it tells the cell to ignore a gene or use a gene or turn up this material, turn down this material. And then the way that our genes are affected can change how we act or feel. For example, we can become reactive to situations that are similar to an original trauma that happened even before we were born, and give us the tools to deal with it better. So these gene changes, as we're learning, are both positive and negative, and they can be transmitted to our children and our grandchildren. To give us an example, let's say our grandparents came from a war-torn country, and there's bombs going off and bullets flying and mishelm everywhere, and they could pass forward a skill set which is positive: sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, to help us survive the trauma that they experience. Now, the problem comes is that, if we're born in suburbia and we don't have a need for these tools, we can inherit a stress response with the dials turned up to 10, let's say, and we're prepared for a catastrophe that never arrives. And then this continuous stress can be harmful to our bodies and our psyches.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of like I can't remember the name of the famous incident, but something about a famined winter, where it turned out that many of the children born around the time of this great famine ended up having a much higher likelihood of catching or developing obesity and cardiovascular disease. So you're talking about how like it's getting carried down genetically. Right. And what I find really interesting, like, to me, this makes very logical sense. It sits very nicely inside the sort of like cosmological framework of physicalism and causality in regards to the psyche and person's behavior. Well, what I find interesting is when you start to go into behaviors that are emerging in people that are not so obviously connected. For example, in your book, you talk about a case study where somebody was getting very cold and would get really frightened or have anxiety around this, and that it had somehow tracked back to somebody in the family who had frozen to death. Like, how is it? Can you explain maybe a little bit more broadly the kind of things that can emerge intergenerationally?
Okay, so first of all, let's talk about these gene changes. So gene change happens because of a trauma, and instead of our genes, we don't inherit genes. We have the genes, but how they express, how they turn on, off, up, down, how they function is a function of these traumas. And so we're finding that these gene changes can be transmitted to our children and even their children, and we're not born with a clean hard drive. There's already, in a sense, an operating system in place, one that contains the fallout of these traumas. And so we can be born with fears and feelings and anxieties and OCDs and depressions that don't always belong to us, which is why I wrote the book, so we can make these links and then break this cycle.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You are, like, let me just look at the exact name of this institute, the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco. Can you explain what Family Constellations are for the listeners, in case that was like a little ping for them and they'd like to hear more?
Family constellations are an external way to image an internal experience. So, for example, when somebody comes to one of my workshops, I might have people on the floor place representatives for their mom, their grandmom, their grandfather, the trauma, those types of things. For example, in a sense, now where there was one talking to me in a chair, there are now 4 or 5 on the floor. And it's a way of working through those traumas in a visceral way where it's quite impactful. When I work with people one-on-one, I developed a different way of working, teaching, experiencing that doesn't involve live people. But family constellations often involve live people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so what I've kind of gathered from reading your work and following some of the other stuff beyond your book is this premise that the family constellation sort of model, the way that you would design this experience for people, which in my mind I'm thinking about the language of externalizing an internal psychodrama so that it could be played out, acted, and thus the act can have a significant and symbolic meaningfulness of resolution for people, that this is an effective means for sort of bringing up and going back into past trauma and even trauma that is being carried in you from generations past, say things that happened to our grandmother or grandfather?
Sure. So, for example, we often don't make the link. That's the problem. Grandpa goes through an experience or grandma has something happen, and we often continue the suffering, but we've not made that link. So in the book, what I help people do is to become detectives of their family history, and also detectives of their what I call core language, but a way to describe it would be trauma language. Mm-hmm. So once we look at the things we say, we could reach the place, which is my hope and which is what happens, for people to say, oh my goodness, I'm carrying the effects of a trauma that isn't even mine. And one of the ways that we can resolve this is by having an experience with our deceased grandfather, or hearing a sentence or saying a sentence to our deceased grandmother or our grandmother even still alive. Grandma, tell me what happened. I have a feeling that I'm also feeling like you feel. So in a sense, when you read the book, there aren't any live conversations with living people where anything's acted out, but I have people go through a genogram, a traumagram, a two-dimensional family tree that as we work it begins to have a three-dimensional effect.
Mm-hmm. See, in this, again, like this fits really simply into my framework, but I can imagine that for some people it might be a little bit sort of confusing. Like, how can I resolve now issues that I'm facing in my life, whether they be, catalyzed specifically by an occurrence in my own life, or if occurrences in my own life have just set me up to reinforce an inheritance of trauma from, say, 2 generations back? How can me having an imaginative, a pretend conversation with my grandmother in my head, how can that create resolution in my present time? What's going on there with the structure of memory and the subconscious and the sort of underneath influences to behavior that allow something like this to be effective?
Well, the important thing is we're making the link. That's the main, that's the first connector. For example, many of us are struggling with mysteries that we live with, unexplained fears and depressions we never get to the bottom of, and anxieties that are sudden, that strike us suddenly when we reach a certain age, and we have no clue what's going on. So it's not so much that conversation that we're having as much as it is discerning the link. Like, oh my goodness. Here, for example, there are signs of inherited family trauma. We can suddenly, when we reach a certain age or we reach a certain experience in our lives, we can have symptoms that weren't there even the week before. For example, we can have what I like to call a sudden onset. This is one of the tell signs. We might have experience a fear or an anxiety or a symptom that strikes us all of a sudden, as though there's an ancestral alarm clock inside us that's ringing. When we reach a certain age or hit a certain milestone, maybe the milestone is we get married, or we go back to our parents' home, or we have a child, or we get rejected by a partner, or we move to a new place. Something actually kicks in or instigates or catalyzes this experience. I once worked with this woman who was consumed with anxiety as soon as she became a new mother. Now, she didn't have anxiety previously, but once she's pregnant, she's terrified and shaking all the time. So asking her some of the questions that I outline in the book, we discovered this link. For example, well, let's hear her sentence. Her sentence is, I'll be, and this goes back to that trauma language that I'm sure we're going to talk about, that core language. Her sentence was, I'll do something terrible and my child will die. And I said, well, what do you mean? She says, I'll harm my child. And I said, have you ever harmed a child? She said, no. I said, did anybody in your family ever accidentally or even purposely harm a child? And she said, no. And then she said, oh my God, my grandmother. And she started to tell me the story about how something that was rarely talked about in the family, her grandmother was a young bride, and she just gave birth to a child. And the child was upstairs sleeping, and she lit a candle, and this candle lit the curtains on fire, and then the house caught on fire, and she couldn't get her newborn out of the house, and the newborn died. And the woman told me, but we were never allowed to talk about this or mention this to my grandmother. You can imagine how that would freak her out if we ever talked about it. So now you can see that one of the issues that we face is when things get silenced, go subterranean, stay hidden, it's more likely to create trauma in the later generations. So here, once she knew that she was carrying her grandmother's experience in her fears, we could take steps to solve it. And now you bring up talking to the grandmom. Well, in real life, she could have said, Grandmom, me too. I'm carrying remnants, biological residues, because of the genetic expression of your trauma. But she didn't have to. I had her close her eyes, and I had her say, tell your grandmother, Grandma, I've been living your experience. And as she begins to say those sentences, she starts crying, and her whole body starts to emote. And you get what I'm saying, where at this moment she's in it. She's right in the experience. Grandma's not even in the room, and she's in the healing experience.
Almost like completing the circuit and letting through the metabolism of direct feeling, letting unresolved things finish, complete, be sort of, for lack of better term, purged and
yes.
and learned from, like allowing the fertilizer, or making fertilizer out of droppings stored in a jar, buried somewhere, hidden away from everyone. Yeah, it's really interesting because I have also been doing the whole workbook aspect of your book, and had gone through just like reflecting and doing this sort of two-dimensional, what do you call it, like a genealogy of trauma? Is that what you called it?
Well, yes, a genogram. We know from Ancestry.com, we do our genealogy. So in the book, I help people do their genealogy. However, I'm interested in the traumas. So I help people complete a traumagram, in a sense. What happened to your mom? What happened to your dad? What happened to your grandparents? That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And I did this, and some very interesting stuff came up. And in respect to my family's privacy, I won't mention details, but I did notice that a significant event that happened to one of my family members that affected the entire family happened at the same age for that family member as was the age that I began getting sort of began slipping up and getting into destructive drug usage in my past. This was addiction and drug use, abuse, for lack of a better term, was an issue that I went through. And having done this genogram of trauma, it's amazing the sense of all of a sudden, because I don't know, maybe other people aren't like me or they are like me, but when I'm suffering, I feel like I'm suffering alone. And that sense of being alone, that I'm dealing with something that's too much for me to deal with on my own, and I'm on my own, can be very detrimental to an actual healing process. I know this is why, like talking circles, ceremony, well-held ceremony, therapist relationships can be really promising. But when I did this genogram, it was amazing to look and go, wow, a lot of the stuff that I'm carrying with me now does come from an inheritance, like it was bequeathed to me. And that in that I felt a sense of not being alone, because it's like, whoa.
I love that you say that. I love that. That's exactly right. It's we as you say, we feel almost on an island, isolated in our pain, and we see, oh no, I'm just a cog in the wheel of a greater pain. And it brings, number one, it brings comfort just to see that it's, where this comes from, that it's not really ours. As the book says, it didn't start with you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it's also comforting to know that once we label it, once we find it, once we know what it is, then we can heal it. In fact, people always ask me, they say, what if you don't have any information about your family? And I always tell them that information exists in that trauma language we carry, that we don't even need to know. That the quality of the language that we speak, along with our idiosyncratic symptoms, the very, occurring at a certain age, that's idiosyncratic. Mm-hmm. Why at age 20 this or 30 this does something happen? Once we see these repetitions in our lives, or these occurrences, these common occurrences, it gives us more than a glimpse of what might have happened in our family history, even if we don't know it. So the trauma is encrypted in our unconscious words, but it's also in our unexplained symptoms. For example, had you talked to me, had we known each other back then when you started slipping through the cracks of your self, in a sense, mm-hmm. I'd have had you pull out that, tell me exactly what the fear is, exactly what you're feeling, what's happening before you start to slip into the hole. And just listening to your language, I might say, did something in your family happen like this? And you might say, oh my God, that's exactly what happened. I didn't even think of that. So some people, we know the information, but we don't know it until we hear it reflected back to us. And that's the idea. You're so smart. From reading the book, you made your own connection. And that's what I see is happening when people read this book. They're making these connections. They're making these links.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because on some level, it's like I could answer that question, and in hindsight, I realized it was so obvious when I describe what I was feeling, with the glaringly sharp vision of hindsight, and how much it relates to this private family event that happened. But I won't do that, because by saying the words, I'm gonna give it away. So sure. Now I wanna slip in, because we're going there, which is the core language approach, which is what you're talking about here. I want you to give us a little bit more of a rundown on how that works, and if you could tie in this discussion you have about declarative and non-declarative memory, which I had at some point had in my mind as explicit and implicit memory.
Yeah.
And how that works into what you mentioned earlier about, say, visualizing in the imaginal this interaction with your grandmother, and how that can have a positive effect by creating a link. And this, I've read the book, so I'm kind of like already on the scoop with this, but this creates an explicit declarative connection, and it's a part of the core language approach. Can you talk about those things and how it unfolds?
So let's start with core language. Like, what is core language? What is this trauma language? So when a trauma happens, as I said earlier, not only are genes affected, but clues are left behind. And these clues kind of submerge into the psyche, or even into the body in terms of symptoms. But they end up, if you follow these clues, it forms. And I'm talking about clues of emotionally charged words, like that woman that I mentioned earlier saying, "I'll harm my child." what? You're going to harm your child? What? Where does that come from, right? It's when we followed it, these words, these sentences, they form a breadcrumb trail. And when we learn how to let it lead us, it'll take us back to a traumatic event in our childhood, or more likely, often likely, in our family history. So we can see that the traumas of our parents, grandparents, they become biologically inherited. And when we know how to uncover these unconscious words, what I call core language, and link them to the original traumas that we now have biologically inherited, it's like finding the missing piece of a puzzle that allows the whole picture to come into view, and then gives us a context that explains why we feel the way we feel. So in the book, I teach you how to be a detective, to uncover these clues and then to link them. And I give these questions, some of these questions that are designed to pull out this unconscious language. For example, one of the questions I ask in the book is, what's your worst fear? If the worst thing happened to you, if things suddenly fell apart, if things went terribly wrong, what's your worst fear? And when people give me that language often links to these events. Now, these traumatic experiences, as I mentioned, they kind of submerge. When there's a trauma, the feelings submerge, images submerge, pieces of behavior emerge, memories are scattered. We don't even have the whole memory. And they're often stored as what you call implicit or non-declarative memory. So these memories, what I'm explaining, they can't be easily accessed. They can't be declared. That's why I go with, rather than explicit and implicit, I go with declarative and non-declarative. And the reasons is they haven't been declared, and because they're not declared, we don't know what's going on. So why is that? So when a trauma becomes overwhelming, we can lose our ability to speak about it or explain what really happened. We can't accurately record or declare the event in story form, which requires language to do so. So without language, without the ability to bring this experience into our prefrontal cortex, into our frontal lobes, into our language centers, we don't know what happened. We just know something happened, and we either remember too much of it or too little of it, because it gets dispersed into fragments. So without language to sort of corral it, these fragments of experience go unnamed, and then they get submerged into our unconscious, and they don't get declared. So core language questions like that one I asked a minute ago, what's your worst fear? It allows us to extract this unconscious material, these memory fragments from the traumatic events, and then bring them into consciousness, bring them into the light of awareness. Once we do that, then we can work with them.
Mm-hmm. This actually reminds me of something that I got in my first aid training, which is after, and I mean, it spreads out all over the place, but after some sort of really intense, moment of being a first responder, say you show up to the scene of a rather gruesome car accident, or someone got hit by a car or something, and it's very intense, and you sort of you go into extreme mode and you fix the situation, and then afterwards is when you start to come down, that it's suggested to, as soon as possible, start talking to other people about your experience, and just really slow down, talk about it as much as you can, describe how you are feeling step by step, every nuance, and it's preventing it from getting carried over into this non-declarative memory by making a story of it right away. And I mean, correct me if I'm mistaken here. In my mind, because I've read a lot on this topic, so I'm not sure which of this next statement I got from your book explicitly, but when trauma is recorded in memory in this non-declarative form, it no longer has a time, place, context, that puts it in the past as a part of your story, but becomes fragmented. And in being fragmented, it's like shining a light onto a disco ball, like a spotlight onto a disco ball. At any given point, it's anywhere and nowhere, which means it's all the time, possibly, and it's never cohesive. It just emerges, and it emerges in a way that's sort of on the back end of your mind until it's fully in your experience, and it's easy to mistakenly connect your present time challenge with this past event, and then it begins to reinforce and gets you almost re-traumatize yourself over and over again over time by not being able to tap into that initial experience and call it into declarative memory.
You explain it beautifully. So anything that reminds us of the trauma, or as I said earlier, we hit a certain age when the trauma happened in our family, or we hit a certain event, a milestone, event like we get married, and after our mom got married, or our grandmom got married, or our grandpa got married, a great catastrophe struck. So almost into the cellular memory of our family is an experience that marriage equates death or destruction. So yes, you named it. We have to name these events, and then we have to find and gather the pieces, corral them together so that they become manageable rather than unmanageable and flashing and all the time, like that disco ball, that shattered disco ball, and living in our present when they belong in the past.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that came up for me as you were speaking before is that doing this, especially doing this in regards to a traumatic event or trauma being carried that is from generations past, there's an opportunity to cultivate a sense of meaning in resolving that, because it's almost like we become the means by which the ghosts that haunt our ancestors are processed and come to resolution to. And this was something that woke up for me some while ago in a very important entheogenic experience that showed me that I am the vertex of all the pain and all the happiness, like all the trauma, all the sickness, and all the healing and all the medicine. I am the vertex of that, of all the family members, like both lineages on my mother's and father's side. And I carry all of those things, and that can be sort of overbearing at times, but it can also bring a sense of meaningfulness, because as I step forward into the future, of course, and this is my own cosmology, I resolve, or say, mitigate my tendency to pass that trauma on to next generations, either in direct action or in this sort of like implicit epigenetic transference onto my children. But I also feel I have a retroactive effect on how that trauma is being held in the entire family system, like all the people in my family who are also affected by it. So there's a deep meaning that can come up for this, and I think for me, it feels very valuable.
That's so well put, James. So well put. I love that you say that this retroactive experience, where as I resolve it, I bring maybe a sense of peace or justice or support or something into the past, and I bring it into the future with me because it lives with me here in the present. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. One of the other primary aspects of your book, I know we've been talking a lot about back generations, and of course this will still apply in this next question, but one of the primary aspects is that the healing of our relationship to our parents and whatever suffering we might be facing in our lives can boil down on a personal level to what you call 4 unconscious themes. Can you talk about those, please?
I can, yeah. There are 4 ways that we can split from our life force. And when I mean split, sort of, again, we don't have the fullness of what is available to us. 4 ways that we can have our success limited, or our health limited, our vitality limited, our relationships affected. And I call these the 4 unconscious themes. I'll describe them. The first theme is we've merged with a parent's experience. So our mom gives away a child, her first child, and we abort unconsciously our first child. So when I talk about these four themes, I call them the four unconscious themes because we don't realize they're happening. The effects of these themes are such that we're reliving or repeating, but don't make the connection. For example, our dad, when he's in his 40s, makes a decision that loses the home and loses his finances. And we don't realize, but then as soon as we hit our 40s, we begin to self-sabotage or make decisions that also affect our financial stability. Or mom and dad break up at 30, and all of a sudden at 30, we lose the desire for our partner. And we don't make the connection that it's connected. Sometimes it even goes back more generations. Grandma became a widow at 30 and never married again. Mom leaves dad at 30. And then we at 30 all of a sudden have disinterest or feel disillusioned with our partner. And we just think it's the relationship, but we don't look at the past archaeology. So these unconscious themes, the first one is merging. I repeat or I relive a piece of life experience, a behavior or a situation of my parents. That's the first one. I've merged with some aspect of my parents' experience. Number two is I reject a parent. And if I reject a parent, well, that has unconscious effects. The first thing, I reject in myself that behavior. So if my father is loud, I reject what's loud in me. If my mother is, I call her, let's say, cold, I can't see when I'm cold. In fact, the behavior expresses in me unconsciously, but it's disowned in me, and I can never see when I'm the same. Another aspect of this is we then project it onto a partner. We pull in a loud or cold partner because we need to re-experience to heal that which is still our blueprint. Or we pull in a nice partner and perceive them as going to be cold, and we're hypervigilant until they become cold. So we can project it. So we either disown it in ourselves and can't see when we're the same, or we project it onto another, or thirdly, we do to ourselves unconsciously what we think was done to us. So if our parents were critical, what do we become? We become inwardly critical. If our parents were aggressive, we become inwardly aggressive. If parents ignored us, we ignore that small fragmented part of ourselves. So I always say that to have a deeper healing experience, we need to heal with our parents, heal those rejections. Number three, the third unconscious theme is we have a break in the bond with our mother. So something happened either in utero or was passed forward generationally. For example, our mother and grandmother were broken. That bond was broken, and we inherited the effects of that broken bond. Or it was re-engineered in utero. Mom was going to give us away, and then she didn't. Mom had 2 babies die before us, and so she couldn't tune in while we were gestating, and then it was too late by the time she tuned in. Or we had a separation at birth, or in an incubator, or a difficult delivery, or some other event in utero that affected our ability to trust our mother's love. Or something that happened early, before the age of 8. We were sent away to grandma's, or our parents were fighting, or drinking, or cheating. You get it? And these events, they're so early often, we don't know what happened. We just know that we're held together with tightness and anxiety, and that we feel insecure. It's difficult actually to know the feeling of who we are. We don't trust the feeling of who we are. And we often have anxiety or shutdown because of one of these early breaks in the bond with our mother. And the fourth theme, the fourth unconscious theme, can be the most interesting. We're identified with someone other than the parents who had a difficult fate or suffered or struggled in the family history. For example, we're identified with a grandfather who hurt somebody, or a great aunt who was victimized in some way, or we're identified with the victims that our grandfather, maybe he was a Nazi, and then we carry the effects of the victims. So it's very interesting, these identifications. We can even be identified with an older brother who died stillborn, where we live lifeless and don't feel like we belong or we're not seen, the way this brother wasn't seen or named. He was undeclared. He wasn't named. Do you get it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those are the four unconscious themes.
Mm-hmm.
We've merged with a parent's experience. We've rejected a parent and then reject ourselves or others. We have a break in the bond with our mom and then have breaks in the bonds with our partner. Or we're identified with somebody and reliving a piece of trauma that doesn't even belong to us.
This focus on looking at the connection with the parent and this wonderful heuristic you offer with the four conscious themes has been really beneficial for me. About 2 years ago, I chose to sort of like basically give up on everything I had built on the other side of the country, or the other side of Canada, which is a fairly large country, with the sort of revelation that if I were to take the next step in my life, in my maturation in becoming a man, I would need to go back to my family home, because I had been gone for a very long time, and heal and explore my relationship with my sister and my parents, and also my nephew, now 2 nephews, that were recently born around the time that I had that revelation. And it's been really meaningful to me to see what can come out in regards to a shift in the quality of my life and my inner subjective experience, in the quality of my relating to my parents over the last 2 years, and really making this a primary focus in my life, and for lack of a better term, as a part of my spiritual maturation.
Wow. You have such a keen intuitive sense, James, to know that you needed to do that. That's a lot of times I'm suggesting it to people, and they'd rather chew thumbtacks than have a relationship with their parents.
Well, thankfully, I mean, not everyone, but most people have pretty dysfunctional family systems, and relationships with their parents aren't super great, a byproduct of the nuclear family, I believe, but and the stresses the economic social system puts on the nuclear family. But mine wasn't so bad. Like, it wasn't great. I mean, I was living on the other side of the world, or the other side of the country, for a reason. Like, I wanted to escape and blah blah blah. And there's a lot to that in regards to what I've learned about my own development and some of the conditioning patterns from early life and now intergenerationally. But it wasn't too bad. I can understand if, for example, if somebody's like, their parents were abusive alcoholics their whole life, that they probably wouldn't want to go, and still are, probably wouldn't want to go move in and like have regular chats. But the value of what you say in the book, which is beautiful, the value of approaching the relationships in a way that allows for healing, is not something that you expect them to change for you, but it's something that changes inside of you in how you relate to them. And in my mind, you can maintain your healthy boundaries with, say, an aggressive or abusive alcoholic or addicted parent, and also heal that relationship internally in a way that benefits your life.
You don't throw yourself under a moving train. That's never advisable. However, when you can step back enough to see that even our parents that were hurtful were hurt, And really, at the core, we're just traumas. When we can have that sort of insight, that understanding, it can bring a new consciousness where we can say any little boy or little girl who was a child in this home would have had the same thing. It wasn't personal. And then we can see that when we begin the healing process, that their pain that they inflicted was just infused by trauma. It takes it out of the realm of where we're victims, but takes it into the realm of, oh, sure, that makes lots of sense. And then we can say, Mom, I understand. Wasn't easy, but I understand. Dad, it wasn't easy, but I understand. And I do make that point in the book that healing, as you say, isn't dependent upon what our parents do, but what we do. The change happens in us. And when we expect our parents to change or be different, we can wait a very long time. But if we allow that change to happen in us, it's amazing how the relationship can blossom, even without it changing on our parents' end.
So I want to widen the angle even greater than just intergenerational family systems. And earlier you mentioned the consequences when you were talking about how the trauma and how trauma affects the body and the psyche can actually be evolutionarily adaptive in so far as, say, you were born in a war-torn country and you're about to grow up around war and violence every day, and that hypervigilance to like watching behind your back and being prepared for a violent attack at any time can be, advantageous to you actually surviving the majority of your life. But can you talk about what this whole thing that we're talking about, intergenerational trauma, how that is expressed in people in a large cultural trauma? So I'm thinking things such as like the European enslavement of Black people, or the abuse and colonizing of First Nations or Native American people by way of things like what here in Canada we had called the residential schools, and even the most recent event, which is obviously relevant to both you and me since we're in North America, which is the Syrian civil war.
What I've seen is that any people who've experienced great trauma or oppression, like the Holocaust or slavery or massacres or residential schools or genocide, if we don't heal the grief that lives inside us, we can find ourselves suffering similarly, or we can see the remnants of these traumas in the generations that follow. And in fact, many of the epigenetic studies that I've seen are based on groups of people who've suffered due to their race or religion or nationality: Cambodians, Rwandans, Holocaust survivors, African Americans, Native Americans. I just recently spoke with an African American woman who, when she reached a certain age and saw a photograph of a lynching, something shifted in her body where she became obsessed with the idea that she could be lynched and her son could be lynched. And this image was, she would, every tree she saw had a body hanging from it. And she couldn't rest until she looked up the names of all the people that had been lynched in America from 1865 to 1965. And she discovered over 5,000 names and took a gold thread and etched them into a black quilt. It wasn't until then she could rest. So here at a certain age or a certain image, it brings up this trauma. Now let's talk about the descendants of residential schools. Well, we know from that experience that the child around age 5 is taken away from the family and put and deculturalized, and in a way having the attempt is to rub the culture out at age 5. And so we can see breaks in the mother-child bond that go back 5 and 6 generations from these kids being sent away at age 5. And also, because of that, we can see descendants of residential schools unconsciously reliving the suffering or the defeat or the despair of these broken families, the despair of their ancestors. And then we can even see a repetition of events that continue to break families apart, or issues of poverty or dependency or depression, despair that continue. We see this in all cultures where there's been oppression that has never been able to fully heal on a cultural level.
Yeah, it's tying this a little bit back to what you were saying before about how some of the traumas that can be passed down through generations might include say somebody in your family did something horrible to another person, and that part of the sort of guilt and consequence of those things is carried like to the person that has nothing to do with your family other than this event, can be carried down through trauma. And I don't believe you mentioned it in this interview, but in your book you talk a lot about unconscious loyalty even to the people that hurt you, and looking at that situation and broadening the vision and looking at how, for example, men have treated women over the course of the last few hundred years, and then even beyond that in a way that is incredibly disgusting, in my opinion, with misogyny and the development of sexism as a sort of like an institutional, like a major institutional factor in our society, and racism as well. You could see how difficult it is to approach this on like a large cultural level when there's just like generations and generations of whole cultures of people who are just deeply traumatized by the past and carrying it forward either in the negative effects of being the victim, or even in the unconscious loyalty of maintaining the role that maybe a great grandfather held as like a sugar cane tyrant or a plantation tyrant in the time of slavery, and carrying that forward as what we see now as, modern neo-Nazi, horrible hate speech garbage and this kind of thing. So it's really, I think, powerful that you've brought this down to a really vulnerable personal level, because it feels like it, and it still is, it's just such a massive problem, and understanding the complexity of it culturally emerging from individual suffering and family suffering over cultures and over time, I think in a way makes it capable to have more compassion and maybe make it more approachable, but maybe I'm being overly optimistic.
Yeah, no, I love your reading of the book. You've read the book so deeply and have pulled out some of the deepest tenets of the book, where, simply put, we can identify in these cultural oppression traumas, the misogynies, the massacres. We can identify with the victim as well as the perpetrator, and then we can find ourselves behaving in a way that, and in fact, sometimes both at the same time. For example, you mentioned in the beginning my work with self-injury. Sometimes the self-injurer can express both behaviors in one action. In one action, I can victimize myself, let's say by cutting into my arm, and in the same action, I'm victimized by myself. And sometimes I'll tell you a story that is the first story that got me to look in this direction. Involved a cutter, a self-injurer. She would cut her arms and legs and abdomen so deeply that she would almost bleed to death. And I didn't quite understand, because I'd worked with cutters before, but I did not understand the depth with which she would cut. And her family would have to rush her to the hospital because she would almost bleed to death. And I asked her one time, let's call her Sarah for the sake of this talk. I said, Sarah, what do you think about in that moment, right before you raise the razor blade and you're about to cut into your body? And she said, I deserve to die? And in that moment, I'm looking at a 24-year-old young woman. And I said, what did you do? You're 24. What have you done? Did you hurt somebody, kill somebody, make a decision that caused somebody? She said, no, nothing like that. I said, did you break up with somebody and they killed them? She said, no, nothing like that. And now here is this 24-year-old young woman carrying the feeling of I deserve to die and then bleeding to death. So I asked her what happened in her family history, and her parents were lovely. Oh, my mom's great and loves me, and I can receive her love and care, and my dad, he's wonderful. But I didn't know where to go. This is 20-some years ago. I'm thinking, well, she has great parents, great childhood. And so something in me knew to ask the next question. Tell me about your grandparents. And boom, she dropped the bomb. She said, well, my dad's mother was an alcoholic, and she was driving drunk. And when my dad was 12, she was driving the car, and Grandpa was in the passenger seat. And she crashed into a pool, drunk. And Grandpa went through the glass and was cut on the cut glass and bled to death before the ambulance, the first responders, could arrive. And who would have felt that they deserved to die? I asked her, and she said, oh, my grandmother would have felt she deserved to die for killing her beloved. And in that moment, she went, oh, you see the connections we can make with this, James?
Mm-hmm.
In that moment, she connected that it wasn't her that needed to bleed to death like her grandfather, nor her that needed to die like her grandmother.
I think this, whenever I hear stories like this, I feel empathically connected. Like, as you were telling that story, I'm just reflecting on what it must have felt like for the grandmother and the father. You said the father was in the car at 12 years old to witness this. And
actually, the father wasn't in the car. But if we continue down that line, he never forgave his mother. She died as an alcoholic when he was 20. And he never could fully grieve his dad, because every time he had to think of his dad, he thought of that horrible death.
Yeah.
So for the father, at 12, he'd pushed away. He'd lost both his mother and his father.
Wow. And I mean, you write it. It's also sort of like increasingly common understanding that anger often works as a defense for sadness, and so not even being able to feel the grief for his dead father, and instead like supplanting it with hatred and resentment to his mother. I mean, it's just such powerful, complex, and I mean, challenging is a lack. It's a word that truly lacks explicit descriptive value, but a really challenging emotional dynamic to live your life through.
Just as you say, exactly. Here's this man who is now a father, and he does well as a husband somehow, and he does well as a father, and he does well in his life. But beneath his anger toward his grandmother and beneath the terror of the event is his grief. And had he gotten to that grief and worked through that anger, she might not have had to viciously cut into her body and carry the grief of that event.
So let's talk about resolution explicitly. Now, there's a couple points where, in describing, and of course, like we're just talking, we're doing this interview here. It sounds like there's like these moments of transcendent realization where the pain and suffering is transcendent, the link is drawn, and it's easy. And then you've also mentioned when we attune to the connection. Say, for example, you mentioned the story of someone talking to their grandmother in that sort of imaginal space, and that it would bring things up in the body, and that it isn't like therapy and resolving past trauma, whether it's yours or from other family members in the past. It's certainly mostly an uncomfortable experience. You write in your book, quote, "When we try to resist something painful, we often protract the very pain we're trying to avoid." And then later you discuss that you've noticed in your clinical experience that within the trauma healing process, an intellectual understanding alone doesn't really seem to make for lasting change, but that healing requires often a deep, visceral, felt experience. Can you explain, why is it important that we feel through this? And what if these feelings are too overwhelming? And as an additional thing, if you're comfortable, what are your thoughts on the psychiatric paradigm of using drugs to, quote, scare quotes, manage symptoms by suppressing feelings?
Sure. So when we move toward resolution, we've also got to feel something. We've got to have an experience that's powerful enough that can override some of these trauma feelings. In other words, we've got this limbic loop or this trauma loop in the brain that's always going, and it's so potent because, it's the way evolutionarily we're designed to have our amygdala keep us safe by scanning for threats so the species survives. But now, all of a sudden, the limbic system is so sensitive and heightened and overly developed in a sense that we've got to have a counter experience powerful enough to override the old trauma response that lives inside so many of us. And then we need to practice the new feelings of this experience. And this new experience that we need to feel can be on the backside of what we don't feel for sure, and often is. For example, if we reject our parents and are angry at them, the healing experience can be receiving comfort and support from them where there was none prior. So it can be any experience, receiving comfort or support from our parents, or receiving comfort and support from ourselves, or feeling compassion for them, or feeling compassion for us, or feeling gratitude in our lives. We're always told to have a gratitude practice, but what really is happening when we have a gratitude practice, we're engaging the prefrontal cortex, and that's where healing can happen. So these experiences of loving kindness or generosity, ultimately anything that allows us to feel strength and peace inside, even being in creative and sitting in meditation, mindfulness, anything that engages our sense of curiosity and wonderful or wonder, or something we experience as positive or meaningful or rewarding. The idea is to have a good experience, a beneficial experience that can steal traction away from our highly efficient trauma cycle that keeps us in a state of suffering. And the real idea is to pull traction away from the trauma response and to bring engagement into other areas of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex. And that's where we can integrate these new feelings, these new sensations, these new experiences, and our brains can change. So that's one of the things I teach in the last third of the book, is how to have a positive experience where we can lay down new neural pathways in our brain and we can heal. Basically, when we revisit the good feelings and the good sensations that are associated with this new experience, this healing experience, this, as you said, it can be even an imaginal experience of talking to our grandmother. Because when we visualize something or we do it in real life, the same regions of the brain, the same neurons activate. The brain doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know where the healing's coming from. So we can have an imaginal experience, and the brain sees it as a real experience because it's activating the same portions of the brain. When we revisit these new feelings, these new sensations associated with this new experience, not only do the structures in our brain begin to wire together in a new way, but we can also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, or feel-good hormones like oxytocin, or estrogen. And even how our genes express can be affected. And this is the part that I'm most interested in. The very genes involved with the body's stress response can begin to change and function in an improved way. And we need to install these new experiences into our body through repetition, through practice, through focus. And that's how we create neuroplasticity. So sometimes I ask my clients to always ask this question: what new thing am I noticing right now in my body? What sensation is going on inside? And if I just stay with it, even if it's uncomfortable, what happens if I stay with it without becoming overwhelmed by it? What eventually happens?
Yeah, this is actually like a technique that I think I just kind of accidentally stumbled into over time, especially using the imaginal, because to me, I feel it's kind of like the place where I can use my working memory to actively build internal experiences that will have real psychological, emotional effects. And I think it started with utilizing nap time as a time where I would just close my eyes and think about a time in my life where I was just really happy and relaxed, and just be there in that time and place for 15 minutes. And then eventually it got down to a point where if I feel myself coming up with some sort of like thing day in, day out, where something comes up and I'm just easily agitated, or I'm sad, or I'm feeling hopeless or helpless or lost or defeated or whatever, that if I can just interrupt the cycle long enough to go, oh, I'm in a cycle, I'll go through an imaginative process. Oftentimes it's checking in, like, how do I feel about my behavior? Is it childish? Or is it sort of adolescent? And then I'll try to connect with the aspect of myself back then. And I go on these like journeys in my mind where I come to resolve things. I hold my my inner child. It's almost cliche at this point, but it's so powerful to be able to hold and send love and receive love simultaneously. When I'm really sad, I envision myself holding myself, saying it's okay, and so I can cry or let go, and I know that I'm also there with me. And it's been incredibly powerful to do what friend and colleague who's also been on the show, Devin Christie, she calls it building a healing vortex. Like, we get stuck in a trauma vortex and we consciously build a healing vortex, and we tap into that when we need it. And it has real palpable, visceral, physical, psychological changes in how we show up in our everyday lives when we do this.
You are so on point, James. That's exactly right. Interrupting the trauma cycle by bringing a either real or imagined feel-good experience into our body that we can install. And the more we practice and install these new experiences, the more we change our brains. One of the things I teach in the book is just what you're mentioning, how the adult part of us can be with ourselves with sentences like, I've got you, I'm here. I'll hold you with our hand, I'll hold you with our breath, and I'll breathe with you until you feel held and safe. And it's important to take time out, especially if we find ourselves slipping down the rabbit hole, to go into an inner experience that allows us to change our brains. Very, very, very smart on your part to know these things.
Well, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
So I just want to tap into this question quickly, because I know we're running really short on time, and I feel like it's important and to get your perspective, because I feel it's rampant and there's also a strong negativity bias towards the use of psychiatric medicines such as tricyclic antidepressants when facing trauma and depression, and which in a way they block from stress. They suppress sort of the negative emotional reactions that are coming up in life. I'm just curious if you can just comment on the paradigm that uses drugs to suppress symptoms by suppressing feelings, and also what your suggestions might be on how we can find a good therapist that won't just drug us up and leave us there, but actually help us take back our lives, which may or may not include psychiatric medicine of some type. Like, how do you feel about this, and what quality should we be looking for when we're looking for a therapist?
Well, the drugs can be helpful in the short term, right, to get us out of the fire, to get us, ultimately, no, we do not want to suppress the very emotions we need to feel. Mm-hmm. That's one of the largest points I make in the book. We need to get in there and find out what is going on, or it will continue to drive the car. However, maybe somebody's in such a state where the drugs are helpful in the short term, the SSRIs, to get someone standing on solid ground. And then once someone's out of the fire, so to speak, they can look at what needs to be brought to the light of awareness. Finding a therapist, well, I would like to find a therapist who's read my book. That's what I would suggest. Yeah. That's why I wrote this book, or taken my training. I have, many clinicians, and I have some clinicians over in Western or Eastern Canada, where you are, that just came back from my training. Some good clinicians that are in Toronto and Ottawa, mm-hmm. That can do this work. So, I wrote this book so therapists, I wanted to generate awareness in the therapeutic community about the impact of epigenetics. That was the first thing. And, I'd like to see this field grow so that practices like these can become standard and clinicians have the tools they need to work with inherited family trauma. These fears and anxieties that people couldn't explain. And, these tools are in my book. So I would like this book to be in the hand of every therapist possible. I know it's curriculum in many schools right now, many universities, and I'm thrilled about that. I also wrote this book to provide help for, people who struggle with the effects of inherited family trauma and don't know where to turn. And the book, like it has done for so many, can guide the reader to a place of realization and healing. And I've seen that happen over and over again. So that's what I would look for. A therapist who knows that inherited family trauma is a real issue and the effects of epigenetics are the real deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, your book certainly is an excellent read, and I had an advanced knowledge, sort of, because I'm already fairly well read on the topic, but it is also a book that I feel is very, very accessible to anyone at any level. It speaks in very plain, very real language and uses specialized vernacular only when necessary, and I really appreciated that. Before I get your contact details and how people can get a hold of you and get your book and all that stuff, do you have any words or suggestions for the people who might be listening right now who may be facing trauma in their life presently, or depression, or any sort of chronic symptom that's really, really bringing them down? Do you have anything to offer those listeners?
Sure. Shake the family tree. Really shake it and see what falls out. What family secrets have been hidden? What stories didn't get told? What traumas never healed all the way? It's important to know these things, especially if we or our children are struggling with symptoms. I found that when we ignore the past, it comes back to haunt us. Yet when we explore it, we don't have to repeat it. We can break these destructive patterns. That's key, really. What happened? What can I, if I'm depressed or I'm anxious or have OCD or or if I'm have phobias, what do I do? I'd say, secondly, talk about these traumas, just like you were telling me before that you've been talking to your folks about what happened. Talk about these traumas in your family and try to work through them, so they're not passed down into future generations. The more we know about these traumas, the more we can talk about them, and the more we're able to bring relief to our kids and to their kids who could be suffering without having a clue as to why. I would love it if parents knew, instead of keeping the past tightly sealed, it's, if I don't tell them, it won't harm them. It's the opposite. What we don't know can have the greatest effect. We're not really immunizing our children when we don't talk about what happened. I would tell parents, if it's possible, hey, tell your kids. And if your kids are young, do it in a gentle way, like with coloring and light and story, and say, oh, I had a grandmom, I miss her, she died young, tell the story. I guess thirdly, we've got to heal the brain's super efficient trauma response that keeps us stuck in a state of suffering. So as I was saying earlier, have new positive experiences, kind of like the ones you were mentioning, James, where you go inside and connect with yourself, or visualize a place or a time when you were healthy. These new experiences, when we practice them, really need to become ingrained in us so our brains can change. And in the book, I lay out many of these practices so we can heal. I guess I'd finish with this idea that biological inheritance, it's true, it's a reality, but it doesn't have to be our destiny.
Beautiful, Mark. Thank you so much for offering your time to the listeners here of ATTMind Radio. And again, thank you for writing your book. It is excellent supportive. It's an excellent support on the healing journey. Can you offer us where we can find out more about what you're doing, maybe your social media handles? And I believe you are doing a couple of workshops, a professional training, and something for non-professionals in Calgary in March, if you could give that info too.
Sure. In February, I'll be in San Francisco. In February, I'll also be in Vancouver. I give 2 book talks in Vancouver on the 15th, and then again on the 16th, and then I have a 2-day workshop on the 18th and 19th. And then in Calgary, I'll be there, I think, the 11th, 12th, and 13th, where I'll be working with chronic conditions and persistent symptoms. The way to find me is markwolynn.com, WOLYNN.com. I'm also on Facebook /Mark Wolyyn, Mark with a K. And my book is called It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle.
Great. Thank you so much again, Mark, for being on the show. And
thank you for having me. It was great to talk to you, James. It's really impressive how much you know and how much you do.
Thank you. I'm honored by that acknowledgement. Thank you. For the listeners out there, thank you for taking the time to listen to another episode of ATTMind Radio. Please take a moment to check out Mark Wolyn's work. As you've heard me say already, I consider it to be very good, and as you've heard it directly from him, he is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom. And regardless of what you choose to do from here, may your life be forwarded with blessings of happiness, healing, and good relationships with your family. All right, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed this episode of ATTMind Radio. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, please head over, check out Mark Wolyn's work, check out his book, It Didn't Start With You. It is quite good. Personally, I found that I got a lot out of it. If you would like to support the podcast specifically, one of the best ways that you can do that is just to head over to iTunes and leave a positive rating and review. Beyond that, you can head to jameswjesso.com /support to look at a variety of different ways that you can be a supporter of ATTMind Radio, such as Patreon, which is how this podcast is funded by listeners like you. So thank you very much, and I will see you on the next episode of ATTMind Radio.